0% of you are subscribed. Fix that.
Social constructs do not equal definitional disagreements.
That's an incoherent statement. Definitions are something that we arrive at socially in order to maximize the utility that we get. Language is something we invented to make it easier for us to communicate. In reality, there's actually no way to either visualize or describe true reality. We can just approximate it through language that mirrors or mimics to the best possible extent what we see in reality. There are plenty of terms that mean a lot to us that have no actual basis in what you would call like an empirical reality. Terms that describe our identity, our preferences, whether you're a top or a bottom. Can you find that in somebody's DNA? No, but it's very important.
Gotcha. And Sleepy Don, or Dan, thanks for your question, says, quote unquote, people of color is a term that doesn't include white people. Is that term racist, Vaush?
It's racially discriminatory in like the groups it refers to, but like the word black doesn't refer to white people, and the word like Coca-Cola doesn't refer to what. I'm not entirely sure what that means. If the argument is that the term POC should also include white people, then that would kind of invalidate the reason it exists, which is essentially to say non-white people, but, you know, I guess in a more woke or academically relevant way. Like, I don't know, there's some validity to the existence of a word that refers to non-white people. We already had the term non-white, so. The rejection of the social, or the utility and social understanding of language by people like P-Jump is a really common tactic that bigots use to ascribe bigotry and bigoted values without actually having the balls to own up to any of the positions held. If you're willing to engage in enough definitional fuckery, you can construct worldviews and linguistic trends that invalidate all trans people, gay people, redefine degeneracy to describe marginalized groups, and say only white people are real humans, without ever actually saying X group is worse or better than the other. The reason I'd argue that trans women are women based on identity is out of social utility. We're not really describing reality with that any more than we are biology. Woman isn't a reality term. It's something we made up. And I think that the world is generally better when, with all the millions of trans people out there, we look at them and say, hey, you know what? Yeah, sure, okay, go for it. It doesn't seem to hurt anyone, helps millions of people. That's social utility.
Vaush, I think you're misusing Foucault's postmodernism.
Nothing that I've said right now is postmodernist. This actually fits very concretely within a modernist theory. The idea that definitions are socially constructed isn't like a postmodernist thing. This is like a basic literacy in the way the world works type deal. I'm pretty sure that even as far back as like Plato and Aristotle, they already had a fairly well-formulated idea of the difference between the world that we can describe and conceptualize and the world that we actually like live in. And we're talking about people, like, these people had some wacky ideas, but even they understood the epistemological ontological gap, the is-ought gap as well. And yeah, I don't know. It's really interesting stuff. There's a, what is it, Stanford.edu Plato? They have some really like basic philosophical terms you can look on there. It's really, really interesting stuff.
Vaush, are you arguing that someone is a bigot for not performing an act that someone else prefers? If so, what is your justification?
Yeah. Wait, not performing an act other people prefer can absolutely be bigotry. If you're at an awards ceremony and you'll shake hands with every white person but not with a black person, yeah, like, and you're like, oh yeah, I just don't shake hands with black people because I shouldn't be forced to do what I want to do. Yeah, of course that could be bigoted. Absolutely, yeah. I don't know why
I think it means in
people...
all cases.
In
like
all cases? No,
them.
nothing. Very few things are in all cases. If you're arguing that there are ways to do things that are in some context bigoted and in some context not bigoted, yeah, of course, obviously. Like, saying like, there are a ton of instances where that's the case. But when we're talking about categorical generalizations, stuff like whether a trans woman is a woman, or referring to trans people by their preferred pronouns, these are things where basically any instance is going to be pretty indicative of your broader attitude towards that group.
Next up, Bubblegum Gun also says, epistemology is an argument from pathos, not logos.
Sure. Oh, people
Gotcha.
who use pathos and logos in common conversation tend to be fairly insufferable as well. No, the problem is, if you went up to an actual philosopher and you said, my understanding of epistemology is entirely reflective of reality, you would get your head caved in by a huge book. The nuances of epistemological philosophy are so complicated and so based on subjective human understandings and interpretations. It's so far beyond my like baseline understanding. I don't even feel comfortable like making strong statements about it, but I know what I just said for a fact.
Vaush, why are you allowed to label me as cis if I've never accepted that label for my identity? By what system or criteria does that label exist?
What? What?
They-
Wait, hold on. You can, if you're trans, you can let me know, and I'll stop referring to you as cis. Humans have hundreds, thousands of labels that we've constructed that we apply to people without asking for their opinion on the matter, like their height, or I mean, the wide variety of things. Their general skin tone, we can make determinations about them, like phenotypically. We can make determinations about the categorizations they fit into society, your nationality, your birthplace, your origin. What do you mean? Do I need to ask a person before I say they're an American, if they're born in America and lived in America their whole lives? If you take issue with that, then feel free to, like, say you're trans and I'll respect you, you know?
Brian F. says, Vaush, does someone have to agree when a biological man says that he's a woman?
You don't have... It's a free country. You can do whatever you want. People are going to be mad at you if you say that a trans woman isn't a woman, and that's their right too. That's the power of living in this country, right? But if you're, like, up in arms about this, they're forcing me to use this language. We've been doing this for as long as human society has existed. Honorifics for elders or people in positions of social power, designators between different racial groups that we've since gotten rid of, pretty much entirely, thankfully. The world, all of human history, has been full of people who will say, you should refer to me as such, and if you don't, I'm going to be upset. Your parents have said that of you. Your boss says that of you. This is not something new. And you can say that of other people, too, with a simple sentence. I would prefer it if you called me X, because people use nicknames too. That's your right. And hopefully, if you've got people around you who are respectful and kind, more so than you seem to be, they'll listen to you when you say that.
I'm gay and I wouldn't have relations with a trans man. Why is that wrong? Why can't we just live happily together and be the best of us?
They would or wouldn't have a relationship with a trans man.
They say they would not.
That's your... You can see... Though, again, I think the group of, like, woke lefty people who are saying you have to fuck trans people is incredibly marginal. I really don't think that's the case, because trans people would rather be with people attracted to them. Okay, that's fine. Also, by the way, I don't think genital preferences are transphobic. You could just be like, oh, yeah, you know, I like dick. And, you know, a lot of trans guys don't have dicks, so... And that's fine. Like 99% of trans people will not bother you over that. They'll be like, oh, okay, because then they'll go find someone else who doesn't mind. It's totally fine.
Tom claims to be straight with that mustache in the year of, with that mustache in the year of our Lord 2021. Vaush, what's the difference between bisexual and pansexual? Why do we have those two different identities?
I think they basically mean the same thing. I've never met a bi person say they were bisexual as a way to get out of saying they're attracted to NB people. It really just seems super, super arbitrary. I guess you could just use them interchangeably. I like pan a little better because it feels like it's a little bit more semantically correct for most people, but, like, there was one time I heard a story of somebody who said, like, it took me 10 years to accept that I was bi. That's the label I got used to. Do I have to go by pan now because I'm okay with NB people? And, like, nah. Just do what makes you comfortable.
Is Tom Jump aware that Alden's University is now accepting online applications? He seems like someone who can benefit from the Coconut Island course. Tom, have you heard of this university?
I think it's the one you went to.
Gotcha. Next one. Genetics researcher, thanks to your question, says, I'm a teacher getting pushback that biological sex doesn't exist. How do you think we can discuss the science of biological sex without offending trans people? Sex is an important concept in the class.
Yeah, a lot of kids are really, really dumb, and they get, like, reflexively angry at arguments that sound parallel to conservative arguments, even though they're true. Sex does exist, of course, though it's not a binary. If you talk to a scientist, they'll tell you that actually it's also, though a highly bimodal, a spectrum. But all you really need to do is say, and if kids don't accept this, then whatever. You can say, I want you all to recognize that sex and gender aren't the same thing, that gender identity is a reflection of yourself, and that sex is more of a biological thing, and even sex is more complicated than a lot of people give it credit for. But for the purposes of this course or this examination, we'll be referring to the two bimodal, sides, the two most common biological invocations of human biology. It's, the male and the female, or something like that. I'm sure. I mean, if there are kids unreasonable after this, that's their fault.
An identity is valid if it tracks an aspect of reality. Are there people who are only attracted to quote unquote cis women. Yes. So doesn't that make super straight valid?
No, it just means cis women and trans women. That would be like saying, like, because some people are only attracted to blonde women, that means that brunette women aren't women. It doesn't necessarily follow. Cis women and trans women are different. I mean, in some ways. Though, I mean, if I want to make the hard argument, there are some trans women post-surgery who pass with clothes on and off so excellently that they would have to tell you could live your entire life with them. And they would just be like an infertile cis woman to you unless they told you. Because, I don't know, the tech's getting pretty crazy these days. That's awesome, you know? Live your life. But anyway, yeah, just cis women. If you don't want to fuck trans women, it's okay. I promise you they won't come chasing after you, you know?
They said if the definition of a label is just anything that uses that label, it loses all meaning.
I defer you to the chair. There's actually tremendous social utility in describing what a chair is. You know, this is a chair, that is a chair. But trust me, you're not going to be able to find an inclusive definition of chair that discludes things that aren't chairs. You're not going to be able to. It's just not possible because it's so like broad. Like, is it a thing we sit on? What's a bench? You know, you can sit on the ground. Is the earth a chair? I don't know. It's really arbitrary. And it comes ultimately down to social preferences. Different cultures will have different ideas as to what fits within the purview of a chair, and none of them are more right or wrong than the others. So, I don't know. This is Wittgensteinian, right? Something is something because people describe it to be something, but we get utility from these definitions.
It's at the point of the battle of words that I have abandoned referring to gender and now only refer to the two sexes.
I guess if you want to, you're gonna lose a lot of social utility in doing that, though. Have you ever been to like an anime con? Do you have any idea how many androgynous people there are wearing maid outfits? What are you gonna scream when you see them? You know, question mark, question mark. You gotta sometimes, you know, you just gotta lean back and get used to the definitional arbitrariety. You know.
Vaush, much of your argument hinges on, in your own words, your definition of transphobia. What is this definition and how does it apply to your argument?
Well, I mean, any definition of anything is going to be fundamentally arbitrary, but I think with transphobia as it was defined there, it falls back on basically the same definition that you would use for discrimination against any group. That is to say, an ideology which describes the marginalization or ostracization or otherization of a marginalized group of people. And since pretty much the number one thing trans people want is to be referred to as the gender they identify as, and that has a very meaningful consequence to their lives, I would say using a separate and also equally arbitrary set of definitions to deny them that ability and that social recognition would constitute bigotry. Much like, you know, oh, black people and white people are the same, but only actually white people are humans. Like, you can construct a lot with stuff like that, but I think there's a lot of importance to inclusivity when it has meaningful consequences.
And then genetics researcher said Vaush is completely wrong. Sex is neither biomodal or a spectrum. Is biomodal a real word now? I didn't know that. Are they meant?
I think they meant bimodal.
Okay, I was like, oh, it's like new things. But they say, can you please explain the genetics of how this would occur? I have a PhD in genetics. This argument is unscientific and prevalent.
I'm sorry. What was the name of the person who sent this donation in?
Let's see. It was, pardon the delay, genetics researcher.
Genetics researcher with the PhD, biomodal. Okay, it could be a typo. Yeah, okay. So the characteristics that we use to determine one's sex are not just chromosomes. Chromosomes can vary. There are people with Y chromosomes who are genetically female. Chromosomes aren't the only one. There are multiple characteristics and variances in the expression of those characteristics. And because it's not a hard line, one or the other, that means that there's a little spectrum. Now, the bimodality with sex is very, very sharp. That is to say, the vast majority of people are going to exist at either mode, you know, the typical male or the typical female. But it remains a spectrum because that bimodality means that it will, even past its peaks, slant towards the center in a small but still significant number of people who are divergent enough from modal sex characteristics that they're, you know, well, intersex, usually. We call them intersex people, of which I think about 1% to 2% of the population is, to some extent or another. It's all very complicated, but I'm sure genetic researcher knows that with the PhD and all.
What if I'm simply unattracted to people who hide or omit something as significant as their transition? I am personally turned off by deceit.
Sure. I do want to be clear. First of all, 99.9% of trans people are going to be pretty upfront about it, okay? I promise you, like, especially now that trans people are becoming more normalized, they tend to let people know. Actually, if you want to ensure that trans people do withhold that information, make sure to marginalize and shun them. Because the more accepted trans people are, the more okay they'll be openly saying, "Oh yeah, I'm a girl, but I've got a big dong," or whatever. It's the more acceptance there. And additionally, when trans people withhold that, it's not necessarily deceit. Most of the time, it's sheer gut-wrenching terror, which. I think you should disclose stuff like that to a person before you sleep with them, just as a general rule, for safety's sake. But just keep in mind that in instances where that doesn't take place, where the trans person isn't upfront about that information, the vast majority of the time, it's because of some perceived or existent social backlash. That doesn't mean that it's good to do necessarily. It just means that there's usually more going on beneath the surface. I'm always open to arguments.
Gotcha. And this one, thank you very much for your question, coming in from Donna Balthazar. Okay. The Jika man. I don't know what. Okay. Next up, they say T-Jump are. Did I just say something bad? They say,
no, you did. I could just tell you're tripping over all my idiot fans trying to throw memes in the super chats. I can see you playing hopscotch around them.
And this one, thank you very much for your question, coming in from Brenton Langle. That's right. Good old Brent says, regarding chair, all definitions are imperfect because everything is imperfect. This is one reason why, quote, appeal to definition is a fallacy.
I mean, if we can imagine two people on a live stream arguing over the proper definition of chair, right? And one person was arguing like, yeah, okay, my definition refers to objective reality, okay? Because the face of the chair, the bottom part of it, has to be within this range of angles from the surface. And then the other person's like, yeah, okay, here's my definition, though, okay? A chair is whatever people consider a chair, though. Have you ever thought of that? And, like, meanwhile, the whole house is burning around them, and in this case, the house is the millions of trans people who need medical care and support and social acceptance. I feel like, what's that phrase from Wittgenstein? Sometimes the best way to answer a question is to stop asking it.
Coming in from Sleepy Dan says, can an unvaccinated person identify as vaccinated? It would mean a lot to them to not wear a mask anymore.
So I'm going to assume this is a person who legitimately doesn't understand the difference between an identity that is determined by one's, self-perception and the actual status of whether or not you've been injected. This is like, if something's an identity, then everything is an identity, no? Well, no. I think there's a lot of socio-utility to be derived from gender being identity-based. I do not think there's utility to be derived from vaccination status being identity-based. Actually, there's quite a bit of negative utility associated with that for the exact reason you just gave, because a bunch of people would be very happy to identify as vaccinated. The extent to which a definition is arbitrary is largely defined by how many component parts there are to the thing being described. So chairs exist, sure, but they're also this mashy social thing, and they can be a million trillion different things. But then you take, say, for example, a proton, and, well, you're right, protons existed before humans, and there's just the proton. But I think that if you look into, like, scientific epistemology, you find that even at a more fundamental level, our understanding of science informs the way in which we consider these things. For example, like, at a very fundamental level, the whole, like, the way that a particle and a wavelength exists simultaneously, that kind of thing, there's a degree of social categorization that we're applying to that state, that duality, that may not exist in another alien's lexicon. I read an article on this, but, like, if you get right down to it, and then you have, like, fundamental particles and stuff like that, and, like, socially, how much do we consider their existence when they don't exist in ways that we think conform to the other rules of the universe? I'm butchering this. Like, there's a whole other realm of research, but there's always something interesting there, you know? It's cool, you know? It's something cool there. Something worth arguing about, you know? The chair argument, they're never ready for it, you know?